18. The life or the soul. I do not know if Leah would be able to walk and talk today had she been treated by Arthur Kleinman instead of by Neil Ernst and Peggy Philp. However, I have come to believe that her life was ruined not by septic shock or non-compliant parents but by cross-cultural misunderstanding. Leah's case, or narrative. As Kleinman would put it, since he believes every illness is not a set of pathologies but a personal story, was one of perhaps 100 Hmong medical cases I heard about over the years. Most turned out badly. The sample is probably skewed, since doctors and patients remember calamities, their own and others, more vividly than they remember successes. Still, the imbalance is disquieting. A child in San Diego was born with a harelip. Her doctors asked the parents' permission to repair it surgically. They cited the ease of the operation, the social ostracism to which the child would otherwise be condemned. Instead, the parents fled the hospital with their baby. Several years earlier, while the family was escaping from Laos to Thailand, the father had killed a bird with a stone, but he had not done so cleanly, and the bird had suffered. The spirit of that bird had caused the harelip. To refuse to accept the punishment would be a grave insult. A child in Michigan had a retinoblastoma, a malignant tumor of the eye. His doctors asked the parents' permission to remove his eye in order to prevent metastasis. His parents fled the state, certain that if their son had the surgery he would be reincarnated, over and over again, with an incomplete body. A child in Minnesota had a spinal deformity. His doctors asked his parents for permission to perform corrective surgery. After his birth in a Thai refugee camp, a Tsivneeb had told the parents that the boy was destined for greatness as a Hmong leader. The Tsivneeb had also warned that if the boy's body were ever altered, his parents would die. A few days after his parents reluctantly acceded to the operation, but before it was performed, his father died. His mother fled the state with her son. A woman in Merced, who had delivered 5 children without complications, arrived at the hospital in the final stage of labor with her 6th child, observing that the umbilical cord had prolapsed, a potentially fatal problem if the cord is compressed by the baby's head. The nurses attempted to relieve pressure on the cord by forcing the woman to crouch on her hands and knees, and pushing the head back inside the birth canal, while screaming at the husband to sign a consent form for a cesarean section. He did so, under duress. But while his wife was being prepared for the surgery, the baby was born vaginally. No interpreter was present. The parents believed that the nurses wished to harm the baby because they thought Hmong refugees had too many children, and that the doctor wished to perform surgery in order to make a larger profit. Accordingly, the mother decided to give birth to all her future children at home. There were, of course, some good outcomes, mostly not in pediatric cases. Here are 3. A young combat veteran who had just arrived in the United States attempted to hang himself in the shower room of the California transit facility in which he had been temporarily placed. During the next several days, he was isolated in a hospital room, offered American food, and forced to submit to a comprehensive medical workup, including blood tests. He neither ate nor slept. Finally, his doctors discontinued the blood work. They gave him Hmong food, and he ate. They let a Hmong man stay with him overnight, and he slept. Learning that he had feared he would be unable to feed his children, they explained the mechanics of refugee cash assistance and showed him photographs of his future home. He and his family resettled successfully in Iowa. A middle-aged man in Merced, hospitalized for an infection, was asked by an interpreter who was filling out a routine nursing admission form whether he wished, in case of death, to donate his organs. The man, believing that his doctors planned to let him die and take his heart, became highly agitated and announced that he was leaving the hospital immediately. The interpreter managed to calm him and assured him that the doctor's intentions were honorable. The man stayed until his recovery a few days later, and a sympathetic hospital administrator, anticipating similar misunderstandings with other Hmong patients, fought successfully to have the organ donor box removed from the admission form. A hospital social worker in San Francisco, accompanied by an interpreter, was sent by the public health department to visit a woman with tuberculosis who had refused to take her isoniazid tablets. The social worker, whose name was Francesca Farr, began to talk to the patient, who was in her 8th month of pregnancy. No, said the interpreter, you should talk to her husband. So Far asked the husband why he didn't want his wife to take the medicine. No, said the interpreter, don't ask him that yet. First, you should wish him some things. Far told the husband she wished that his children would never be sick, that their rice bowls would never be empty, that his family would always stay together, and that his people would never be in another war. As she spoke, the husband's hands, which had been clenched, relaxed. Now, said the interpreter, you can ask him why his wife isn't taking the medicine. Far did. The husband answered that if she took the medicine, their baby would be born without arms or legs. Far touched the patient's abdomen, and told the husband that if the baby didn't already have arms and legs, the woman wouldn't be so big, and the baby wouldn't be kicking. The husband nodded, walked into the other room, returned with a giant bottle, dumped the contents into Far's hands, and said that his wife would take the pills. This last case warrants particular scrutiny, because Francesca Far did a number of things that generally weren't done at MCMC, and certainly weren't done with Leah. She made a house call. She took along a capable and assertive interpreter whom she treated as a cultural broker, by definition her equal, and in this case her superior, not a translator, her inferior. She worked within the family's belief system. She did not carry her belief system, which included a feminist distaste for being forced to deal with the husband instead of the wife, into the negotiations. She never threatened, criticized, or patronized. She said hardly anything about Western medicine. She flew completely by the seat of her pants. Also, Francesca Far liked the Hmong, loved them. I should say, that was something she had in common with everyone I knew who had ever worked successfully with Hmong patients, clients, or research subjects. Dan Murphy once said that of the 10 most admirable people he had met in the last decade, 7 or 8 were Hmong. Janine Hilt told me that if her house caught on fire, the first thing she would grab was a framed pine top that Phua had stitched for her. It still hangs in a position of honor over her partner's dining table. Suki Waller said that after she spent time with her Hmong clients, Americans, by comparison, seemed dry. The anthropologists Eric Crystal and Dwight Conquergood were so intoxicated by Hmong culture that their ethnographic commentaries, while academically unimpeachable, sometimes sounded like mash notes. Neil and Peggy liked the Hmong, too, but they did not love them. They could have had a practice full of white middle-class patients who always took their medicine and whose insurance companies always paid on time. Instead, because they were altruists, they had the antithesis. Their choice was morally satisfying, but whenever a patient crossed the compliance line, thus sabotaging their ability to be optimally effective doctors, cultural diversity ceased being a delicious spice and became a disagreeable obstacle. Neil and Peggy were excellent physicians, but by Kleinman's definition, the concern for the psychosocial and cultural facets that give illness context and meaning, they were, at least during their early years with Leah, imperfect healers. But love, unlike the etiology and diagnosis of pediatric seizures, cannot be taught. It can only be granted. I believe that Neil and Peggy now love Phua. In its absence, is there anything else that doctors can do to take better care of their Hmong patients? Bruce Thopao Blyatout, the Hmong medical administrator who wrote about mental health problems as traditional ailments of the liver, has some suggestions. Not surprisingly, almost all of them are cultural, not medical. To improve Hmong healthcare in general, arrange for female doctors to treat female patients, and male doctors to treat male patients. Involve the patient's families in all decisions. Use interpreters who are both bilingual and bicultural. Asterisk to persuade Hmong people to undergo necessary surgery, and to improve the outcomes if they consent. Enlist the support of family and community leaders. Minimize blood drawing. Allow relatives or friends in the hospital room around the clock. Allow shamanic ceremonies in the hospital. To improve mental health, encourage traditional arts such as weaving, music, dance, and silversmithing. Acknowledge Hmong contributions to U.S. military operations in Laos. Promote clan reunification through secondary resettlement. Be careful not to undercut the father's authority in Hmong families. Give refugees more opportunities to help themselves. Fuss over them less. Most important, says Blyatout, and many others as well, practice conjoint treatment, that is, integrate Western allopathic medicine with traditional healing arts. Or, as now qaug put it, use a little medicine and a little neeb. Kleinman, who has commented that the doctor cures the disease but the indigenous healer heals the illness, believes that conjoint treatment does more than promote trust between the doctor and the patient. Because illness is so profoundly affected by psychosocial factors, it actually improves the outcome. Although the Lees did treat Liao with herbs, dermal therapies, and animal sacrifices, their regimen ran parallel to Lia's medical course rather than intertwining with it. Neil and Peggy were dimly aware of some of these remedies, for example, when Lia had marks on her chest from coin rubbing. But they never asked about them, and they certainly never recommended them. It would never have occurred to them to emulate Luis Estevez, a pediatrician at Lincoln Hospital in the Bronx, who has referred Puerto Rican and Dominican patients to a Santeria high priest as he might refer them to an ophthalmologist. Or Yasmin Colazo, a psychiatrist at Elmhurst Hospital Center in Queens, who has allowed a Mexican curandero, or folk healer, to perform a cleansing ceremony in the hospital for a schizophrenic patient. Dr. Colazo said that after the visit, the patient was far more compliant in taking her antipsychotic medications, which she believed the curandero had sanctified. Blyatout wrote, since Hmong health treatments never hurt anyone, but could possibly help a patient, they should be seriously considered as part of a client's course of treatment. Unfortunately, his first premise is not always true. Some Hmong folk remedies contain arsenic, lead, and opium. However, intervention by its Siv Neeb, whose work is conducted entirely on a metaphysical plane, is always safe, and many people, including Blyatout, Suki Waller, Dwight Conquergood, and the French anthropologist Jacques Lemoyne, believe that because the mind-body dichotomy does not exist in Hmong culture and because so much illness among Hmong refugees has a psychogenic element, that Siv Neeb is an ideal collaborator in the healing process. Indeed, according to Conquergood, no one is better qualified to span the gap between the medical and the spiritual. Shamans are, first and last, quintessential mediators. They are threshold crossers, endowed creatures who can go between the earth and the sky. Grand articulators. Shamans' special gift and mission is to bring opposites together, to bring the physical and moral worlds into meaningful conjunction. That is why they are identified with archetypal connectors such as images of ladders, bridges, ropes, and cosmic trees that sink roots into the earth while branching towards the sky. It is the special responsibility of the shaman to celebrate and actualize the coincidences between these two kingdoms, and to amplify their resonances, one into another. Perhaps that is why shamans do not resist prescription medicine and physical treatments. These forms of medicine do not directly compete with the shaman's manipulation of symbols and management of belief. Indeed, I saw bottles of prescription medicine resting without contradiction on shamans' altars inside thatched huts in Camp Ban Vinai. They see the two modes of healing, natural and supernatural, as complementary rather than contradictory. Conquergood should know, having been at Siv Neeb's patient himself when he had dengue fever. He has described his soul-calling ceremony, which was attended by most of his friends at Ban Vinai, and which he claims was truly restorative, as a festive and affectionate drama that was saturated with care and human kindness. Lemoyne has commented that its Siv Neeb is far more like a psychiatrist than like a priest. However, there is a crucial distinction. Comparing his work to psychiatric procedure, I noticed that while the analyst tries to provoke self-analysis by scratching the wounded part of the self, a Hmong shaman will provide an explanation which avoids all self-involvement of the patient. The patient is always represented as a victim of an assault from outside powers or of an accidental separation from one part of his self. When this situation has been identified and overcome by the shaman, health is recovered. At no point has there been a feeling of guilt associated with suffering. When I read this, I thought of how often the Hmong react to threat or blame by fighting or fleeing, which in the medical arena translate to various forms of noncompliance. That Siv Neeb's exclusion of guilt from the transaction dovetails perfectly with the Hmong temperament. The doctor's standard message, if you don't take these pills have this operation see me again next Tuesday, you'll be sorry, does not. During the mid-80s, the Nationalities Service of Central California in Fresno received a short-term federal grant of $100 965 to establish what it termed an integrated mental health delivery service utilizing Hmong healers and Western mental health providers. 8 Sivneebs were hired as consultants. They treated 250 patients, most of whom had complaints that transcended the usual boundaries of mental health. The resulting project report, which contains descriptions of 18 healing ceremonies, including ceremony to dispel ogre spirits, ceremony to separate this world from that of the afterlife, and ceremony to appease the spirit above the big stove, is one of the most amazing documents ever financed by American taxpayers. Sometimes the ceremony by itself was enough, it concluded. In other cases, once such a ceremony was performed, the client was more amenable to recommended medical procedures, such as surgery or medication, administered by licensed healthcare providers. Here are the report summaries of 2 cases that had different, though equally positive, resolutions. Case No. 3. Complaint symptomatology, gallbladder problem, mobbed SIB. The client suffered from a sharp pain on the right side of the chest extending to the back. He reported inability to engage in any activity other than passive relaxation. Assessment. A licensed physician diagnosed the condition as a gallbladder problem requiring surgery for correction. The Nang Sivneeb was consulted following this diagnosis. Treatment plan. The Nang performed a ceremony during which healing powers were bestowed on water, which was then used to wash the painful area in order to release the pain. However, the pain persisted and the client accepted that it was not a spiritual problem. He then returned to the physician and consented to surgery. Result. The surgery was successful and the client reported that his illness was cured. Case No. 9. Complaint symptomatology. The client's penis had been swollen for about a month. He reported that he'd been treated by licensed physicians, but that the treatment had only given intermittent relief from pain and swelling. Assessment. The Nang determined that the client had offended the stream spirits. Treatment plan. The Nang called upon the Nung spirits to effect a cure and release the pain. The Nang used a bowl of water to spray from the mouth over the infected area. The offended spirits were offered payment of 5 sticks of incense to release the pain and relieve the swelling. Result. The client got better after the ceremony. After 14 months, the grant for the program expired, and, as far as I know, that was the first and last penile exorcism to be sponsored by the Department of Health and Human Services. However, in many less recondite ways, the medical establishment appears to be waking up to the fact that since 1990, more than half the population growth in the United States has come from immigrants and their children, and that many of these immigrants, even if they can get to the hospital and pay for their treatment, may find mainstream healthcare culturally inaccessible. The 1992 edition of the Merck Manual of Diagnosis and Therapy, the world's most widely used medical text, included, for the first time, a chapter called Cross-Cultural Issues in Medicine. The chapter was allotted only 3 pages out of 844, and it was not cross-referenced in the chapter on e-patient compliance, or indeed in any other chapter. However, merely printing such phrases as spirit attack, trance state, and cultural relativism granted them an ex-cathedra legitimacy. Where Merck went, others could follow without fear of sounding like cranks. 10 years ago, hardly any medical school or residency curricula included cross-cultural training. In 1995, for the first time, the National Guidelines for Training Psychiatry Residents stipulated that they learn to assess cultural influences on their patients' problems. In 1996, the American Academy of Family Physicians endorsed a set of recommended core curriculum guidelines on culturally sensitive and competent healthcare. Among the resources suggested by the guidelines authors was Bafa Bafa, a simulation game in which the participants are divided into 2 mythical cultures, each assigned a different set of manners, conventions, and taboos. Each group inevitably misperceives the other by applying its own cultural standards. Each inevitably offends the other, and each, until the groups meet at the end of the game to discuss the pitfalls of ethnocentrism, is inevitably certain that its culture is superior. Today most medical students at least brush shoulders with cross-cultural issues, and some form more than a glancing acquaintance. The University of Wisconsin recently developed an integrated multicultural curriculum that includes panel and group discussions, case conferences, student interviews, role-playing exercises, and home visits. At Harvard, all first-year students are required to take a course called Patient-Doctor I, significantly, not Doctor-Patient I, in which they learn to work with interpreters, study Kleinman's 8 questions, and ponder such conundrums as, can an American pediatrician truly explain a surgical consent form to newly arrived parents of a Southeast Asian baby? And, is it ethical to use psychotherapy when therapist and patient are ethnically unmatched? Some residency programs are evolving along the same lines. At San Francisco General Hospital, all family practice residents are required to do a rotation at the refugee clinic, in which, since 1979, more than 20,000 refugees, speaking dozens of languages, have received health screenings. Francesca Farr, who persuaded the Hmong man to let his wife take her isoniazid, was a social worker at the refugee clinic. In addition to briefings on hepatitis B, thalassemia, and intestinal parasites, the residents' orientation manual includes an article on assessing symptoms in Southeast Asian survivors of mass violence and torture, a set of guidelines for working with interpreters, and an 8-page chart that compares the social and cultural customs of the Vietnamese, Cambodians, Lao, and Hmong. High-mindedness in the big leagues is all very well, but how much of this kind of thing was likely to trickle down to a place like Merced? As it turns out, a lot more than I expected. In 1996, the Merced County Health Department invited a Seattle-based cross-cultural education program called Bridging the Gap to train its nursing, administrative, and interpreting staffs in advocacy skills and cultural competence. The health department now produces a segment for the local Hmong cable channel that features a tour of MCMC and answers in Hmong some commonly asked questions, including, why are doctors so rude? At MCMC, a 55-year-old Hmong man nearly died recently from a perforated bowel after his family took 3 days to consent to surgery, because he stayed in the hospital for more than 2 months, and every resident either cared for him or debated his case in the corridors. He galvanized interest in such questions as, could Civ Neebs be certified, like clergy, to visit MCMC patients? Could Hmong serve as cultural brokers? If MCMC employed certified interpreters instead of lab assistants and nurses' aides who translated on the side, a plan that had previously been dismissed as too expensive, would hospital stays be shortened and costs thereby reduced? This last question was particularly germane, since managed care had drastically eroded MCMC's referrals and hospitalizations, and the county was so nervous about the resulting deficit that it was planning to lease the hospital to a large healthcare corporation. But change comes hard, especially in the trenches. It is one thing to read in medical school that the ideal doctor-patient interpreter seating configuration is a right triangle, with the patient and interpreter forming the hypotenuse, and another to recollect the diagram in a roomful of gesticulating Hmong toward the end of a 24-hour shift. When I heard of Merced's latest cross-cultural efforts, I remembered an elderly Hmong woman with stomach cancer whom I had once met at MCMC. Her family, unable to understand either the resident's English or his drawings of the digestive system, had refused to consent to surgery. I had expected the resident to move heaven and earth to bring in a decent interpreter. Instead, I found him in the preceptor library, his head bowed over 4 articles on poorly differentiated gastric adenocarcinoma. I also remembered a morbidity and mortality conference during which Dan Murphy presented the case of a middle-aged Hmong woman, rendered comatose by a stroke. Her family had staged an insurrection at her bedside, demanding that her intravenous and nasogastric tubes be removed and that a Civ Neeb be permitted in the intensive care unit. MCMC had acceded, and she had died. Every time Dan tried to steer the discussion toward cultural issues, the residents yanked it back to a debate on the relative merits of labetalol and hydralazine as antihypertensives. This is the kind of thinking that has begotten the cartoon version M.D. the all-head-no-heart formalist who, when presented with a problem, would rather medicate it, scan it, suture it, splint it, excise it, anesthetize it, or autopsy it than communicate with it. Fortunately, most real-life doctors, including MCMCs, are not automatons. However, They often seem myopically over-reliant on what Kleinman calls the culture of biomedicine, which, when he says it, sounds every bit as exotic as the culture of the Ainu or the YY. Their investment in this culture does not make them resist change on general principle. Quite the contrary, they eagerly embrace new drugs, technologies, and procedures as soon as clinical trials prove their effectiveness. Yet they may not feel the same way about Kleinman's 8 questions, but diseases aren't caused by spirits. Why should I indulge delusions? Or his proposition that ethnographic methods should be part of every doctor's job description, but I'm not an anthropologist. I'm a gastroenterologist. The same doctors who listen to continuing medical education audiocassettes on their car stereos, intent on keeping up with every innovation that might improve their outcome statistics, may regard cross-cultural medicine as a form of political bamboozlement, an assault on their rationality rather than a potentially life-saving therapy. On the wall above my desk, flanked by pictures of Leah and her family, are 2 Xeroxed passages that, in a jaundiced mood, I once captioned the Hmong way and the American way. The Hmong way is the page from the Fresno Mental Health Report that summarized the Sivneeb's successful treatment of his patient's swollen penis. The American way is a page from the Journal of the American Medical Association. It was excerpted from an article called Doctors Have Feelings Too. Its author, a Harvard Medical School instructor named William M. Zinn, posited that because doctors may be busy doing multiple other tasks, maintaining a clinical distance, or harboring guilt about negative reactions to their patients, they run the risk of overlooking their feelings. So, if you're a doctor, how can you recognize that you're having a feeling? Some tips from Dr. Zinn. Most emotions have physical counterparts. Anxiety may be associated with a tightness of the abdomen or excessive diaphoresis. Anger may be manifested by a generalized muscle tightness or a clenching of the jaw. Sexual arousal may be noted by a tingling of the loins or piloerection. And sadness may be felt by conjunctival injection or a heaviness of the chest. I first read this article at Bill Selvage's house. Every night, while I waited for Bill to come home from MCMC, I alternated between his old anthropology texts and his piles of medical journals, and pondered which was the more arcane. I remember sitting on the dilapidated sofa, thinking that if any of my Hmong friends heard that American doctors had to read an article in order to learn how to tell if they were angry, they would never, ever return to MCMC. In lurched Bill, nearly ataxic from fatigue after a 33-hour shift. I read him the paragraph that is now on my wall. We both laughed so loud we probably woke his fundamentalist neighbors, the ones who had smashed their TV set and danced a jig around it. Bill assured me that he was so remarkably in touch with his feelings that he could tell if he was anxious or sad without benefit of diaphoresis or conjunctival injection. I believed him. Bill was a G.P. of the old school, the sort of doctor who relieved his stress by going to MCMC's newborn nursery, selecting a crying baby, and walking back and forth with it until it quieted down. Yet I feared that Dr. Zinn had a point. Medicine, as it is taught in the United States, does an excellent job of separating students from their emotions. The desensitization starts on the very first day of medical school, when each student is given a scalpel with which to penetrate his or her cadaver. The ideal patient, as it is nicknamed, since it can't be killed, never complains, and never sues. The first cut is always difficult. 3 months later, the students are chucking pieces of excised human fat into a garbage can as nonchalantly as if they were steak trimmings. The emotional skin thickening is necessary, or so goes the conventional wisdom, because without it, doctors would be overwhelmed by their chronic exposure to suffering and despair. Dissociation is part of the job. That is why doctors do not treat their own relatives. Feelings would handicap their effectiveness. Why? Beyond routine issues of sterility, the heads of open-heart patients are screened from the surgeon's view. Individuality would be a distraction. And why Neil Ernst avoided Leah Lee after she returned from Fresno with irreparable brain damage? He couldn't bear it. At Stanford Medical School, in an admirable attempt to fight this trend, students are informed during the first semester that their empathy may already have peaked. If they succumb to the norm, it will plunge steadily during their 4 years of medical school and their first year of residency. What changes? An appalled student once asked. His professor answered, as you get more skilled. You belittle what you had before you started. Stanford, like several other medical schools, is trying to bring back what has been called the whole doctor whole patient model, in which the doctor brings his or her full humanity, not just the part that aced them cats, to the hospital, and the patient is viewed as a complete person, not just the appendix in room 416. This model is nothing new. In fact, it is what all doctors used to be taught. As William Osier once said, or is said to have said, ask not what disease the person has, but rather what person the disease has. Between 1992 and 1995, the percentage of medical school seniors who chose to become generalists, internists, general pediatricians, and family physicians nearly doubled, a trend that may help bring Osier's charge back into circulation. Some of these choices have been influenced by economic factors. Managed care plans prefer primary to subspecialized care because it's cheaper, but others are surely idealistic. If there were more Osler-type generalists around, the Hmong, among others, would stand to benefit. The anthropologist Elizabeth Curtin has commented that a Hmong patient she knew, referred to a specialist for further treatment, did not ask the referring physician to find someone skilled or famous. He asked, "Do you know someone who would care for me and love me?" It was probably unfair of me to caption Dr. Zinn's article. The American Way. Once, several years ago, when I romanticized the Hmong more, though admired them less than I do now, I had a conversation with a Minnesota epidemiologist at a healthcare conference. Knowing she had worked with the Hmong, I started to lament the insensitivity of Western medicine. The epidemiologist looked at me sharply. "Western medicine saves lives," she said. "Oh, right." I had to keep reminding myself of that. It was all that cold, linear, Cartesian, non-Hmong-like thinking which saved my father from colon cancer, saved my husband and me from infertility, and, if she had swallowed her anticonvulsants from the start, might have saved Leah from brain damage. Dwight Conquergood's philosophy of healthcare as a form of barter, rather than a one-sided relationship, ignores the fact that, for better or for worse, Western medicine is one-sided. Doctors endure medical school and residency in order to acquire knowledge that their patients do not have. Until the culture of medicine changes, it would be asking a lot of them to consider, much less adopt, the notion that, as Francesca Farr put it, our view of reality is only a view, not reality itself. However, I don't think it would be too much to ask them to acknowledge their patients' realities, to avoid the kind of blind spot that made a Merced Health Department employee once write about a child from a family that views the entire universe as sacred. Name, Lia, Lia. Principal language, Hmong. Ethnic group, Hmong. Religion, none. Dwight Conquergood's Sivneeb may have had no trouble crossing the threshold between earth and sky. Natural and supernatural, medical and spiritual. Regular mortals find the transit difficult. How difficult was borne out to me the night I invited Bill Selvage and Suki Waller to dinner at the Red Snapper Seafood Grotto. Since my experience with Jonas Vangay, I was steering clear of the cask and cleaver. Although they knew each other by reputation, Bill and Suki had never met. I thought that because they were both Peace Corps veterans, and because they both worked with the Hmong, Bill as a doctor, Suki as a psychotherapist, they would have much in common. Over our fish, we discussed Hmong shamanism, about which Suki knew a great deal. She volunteered that she had once told a doctor at MCMC that a Sivneeb of her acquaintance had a direct line to God. The doctor had responded, "Well, I have a direct line to biochemistry." Although it was clear where Suki's sympathies lay, Bill did not appear offended. By dessert, we had moved on to Leah's case in particular, and cross-cultural pediatrics in general. "You have to act on behalf of the most vulnerable person in the situation," said Bill. "And that's the child. The child's welfare is more important than the parents' beliefs. You have to do what's best for the child, even if the parents oppose it, because if the child dies, she won't get the chance to decide 20 years down the road if she wants to accept her parents' beliefs or if she wants to reject them. She's going to be dead." "Well," said Suki tartly, "that's the job you have taken on in your profession." "I'd feel the same way if I weren't a doctor," said Bill. "I would feel I am my brother's keeper." "That's tyranny," said Suki. "What if you have a family who rejects surgery because they believe an illness has a spiritual cause? What if they see a definite possibility of eternal damnation for their child if she dies from the surgery? Next to that, death might not seem so important. Which is more important, the life or the soul? I make no apology, said Bill. The life comes first. The soul, said Suki,